There is a specific kind of silence that follows the moment you realize you have been completely and deliberately deceived by someone you chose to build your life around. Not the silence of a quiet room, the silence of a world that has just shifted 2 degrees off its axis and has not yet decided where it is going to settle. I know that silence very well now. I lived inside it for about 4 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon in a parking garage in the 3rd level of a building where I had just attended what I believed was a routine meeting. My name is not important. You can call me Marcus. I was 41 years old, a commercial real estate broker with 15 years in the industry, a good reputation, a solid client base, and until 4 minutes into that Wednesday afternoon, a fiancée named Isabel whom I had planned to marry in 7 months. Let me tell you about Isabel first, because the shape of the deception only makes sense if you understand how she presented herself. She was 36 years old when I met her at an industry networking event 3 years before all of this happened. She was a financial consultant, she said. Independent practice, high net worth clients, boutique operation. She was sharp and composed and spoke about money with the casual authority of someone who had been thinking about it professionally for a long time. She was also the most deliberately charming person I had ever met, though I would not understand the word deliberately until much later. We dated for 8 months before I introduced her to my family. My mother liked her. My sister said she seemed polished. My brother-in-law, who was a cautious man by nature, said he was glad I was happy. None of us knew enough to look further than the surface she had prepared for us. We got engaged after 2 years. She moved into my apartment 6 months before the engagement, because I had suggested it, and she had agreed with the specific kind of warmth that made every decision feel mutual and considered. I paid the majority of the household expenses during that period because her practice, she said, was going through a transition. A larger client had restructured their portfolio and her quarterly revenue had dipped. She expected it to normalize in 3 to 4 months. 3 to 4 months became 6. 6 became 8. I did not press it because I loved her and because the amounts involved were manageable and because she spoke about the transition with such specific professional fluency that I had no reason to doubt the explanation. I was paying her cell phone bill, her car insurance, her gym membership, and half of everything else for 8 months, and I had constructed an entirely reasonable explanation for why that was temporary and fine. The meeting on the Wednesday afternoon was with a client named Harold, a 63-year-old retired physician who had been referred to me by a mutual contact and who was looking to invest in commercial property for the first time. We had a good meeting. He was thoughtful and asked good questions, and I left feeling like the relationship was going to develop well. I was in the elevator to the parking garage when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I did not recognize. The text said, "I think we should talk. My name is Kevin. I believe we are both engaged to the same woman." I stood in the elevator and I read that text 3 times. Then the doors opened on the 3rd level and I walked to my car and I sat in it in the silence I described at the beginning and I thought about what to do. I called the number. Kevin was 44 years old, a commercial contractor based in a city 2 hours away. He had been engaged to a woman named Isabel. He described her and I confirmed it was the same person from the description alone before he sent me a photograph for 5 months. They had met at an industry event. She had presented herself as a financial consultant with an independent practice. She had moved into his house 4 months ago because her lease had ended and it made sense given the engagement. He was covering most of her expenses because her practice was going through a transition. He said those last 2 words with a specific flatness that told me he had been thinking about them recently in a way that it started to feel uncomfortable. He had found my name and number through a combination of Isabel's phone. He had seen a text preview on a screen he had not meant to see, and a reverse contact search. He had sat with what he found for 2 days before he texted me. I said, "Kevin, how long has she been living with you?" He said, "For months." I said, "She's been living with me for 6. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How is that possible?" I said, "She travels. For clients," she says, 2 or 3 times a month, 3 to 4 days at a time. He said, "She does the same." I said, "Kevin, I need to ask you something directly. How much money have you extended to her since she moved in?" He named a figure. I named mine. Between us, across the 2 households, Isabel had extracted just over $60,000 in covered expenses, direct transfers she had requested for various reasons, and what both of us had been told were temporary loans against incoming client payments that had not yet cleared. $60,000, divided invisibly across two men in two cities who each believed they were her only future and her current financial safety net. Kevin and I talked for 2 hours that first call. By the end of it, we had agreed on 3 things. First, neither of us would confront Isabel before we knew the full picture. Second, we would each begin quietly pulling together every financial record, every transfer, every documented expense from the period of the relationship. Third, we would meet in person within the week. We met 4 days later at a hotel halfway between our two cities. Kevin was a steady, deliberate man who had clearly spent the 4 days between our call and our meeting doing exactly what he said he would do. He arrived with a folder. I arrived with a folder. We sat across a hotel lobby table, and we laid it all out. The transfers, the expense coverage, the loan requests, and the always imminent client payments that had never arrived. The pattern was identical across both relationships, down to the language she used in her requests, almost word for word in some cases. She was not a financial consultant. We established that within the first 30 minutes of comparing notes. Neither of us had ever seen a client, a contract, an invoice, or any documentation of actual professional work. We had both been given explanations for why that was: client confidentiality, sensitivity of portfolio information, the nature of high net worth relationships requiring discretion. Those explanations had each been entirely plausible in isolation. Together, across two separate men who had received the same explanations independently, they became something else entirely. Kevin had done something I had not thought to do. He had run her name through public business registration records before our meeting. There was no registered LLC, no DBA, no professional license in her name in any state he had searched. There was, however, a civil judgment from 6 years ago in a county 3 states away. Plaintiff was a man. The judgment was for $11,000. The cause of action was fraud. The civil judgment was the moment everything became fully clear. This was not something that had started with Kevin or with me. This was a pattern that predated both of us by at least 6 years and possibly longer. We were not victims of a woman who had made bad choices. We were targets of a woman who had developed and refined a specific operational approach over time, who had learned from previous iterations, and who had selected both of us with a care and deliberateness that was, once you understood it, genuinely chilling. I said, "Kevin, how do you want to handle this?" He said, "I want every dollar back, and I want to make sure she cannot do this to the next person." I said, "Those are both achievable, but we need to do it correctly." He said, "Do you have a lawyer?" I said, "I'm going to have one by tomorrow morning." He said, "So am I." I called Patricia Shun that evening. I told her everything in 15 minutes. She asked 6 questions. Then she said, "What you are describing is a pattern of wire fraud, potentially a long-con confidence scheme, and depending on how the financial transfers were structured, potentially interstate fraud given the 2-city operation. This is serious, and it needs to be approached in a specific sequence." I said, "Tell me the sequence." She said, "First, you and Kevin each pull together complete financial documentation of every transfer, expense, and loan request with dates, amounts, and any written evidence such as texts or emails. Second, we file a joint civil complaint naming her individually and seeking full restitution across both plaintiffs. Third, we prepare a referral package for the FBI's wire fraud unit because the interstate element and the documented prior civil judgment make this a federal matter. Fourth, and this is important, we do all 3 of these things before she has any indication that you and Kevin have spoken. Can you move quickly?" I said, "We already have the documentation." She said, "Then we move tomorrow." The civil complaint was filed 9 days after Kevin and I met in that hotel lobby. It named Isabel individually, sought full restitution of all documented financial transfers across both plaintiffs, totaling $61,400, sought damages, and included as an exhibit the civil judgment from 6 years prior that Kevin had found. That judgment, Patricia noted in the filing, established a documented prior pattern of materially similar conduct that was directly relevant to the current claim. Kevin's lawyer, who had coordinated with Patricia closely over those 9 days, filed a parallel declaration supporting all factual elements of the complaint. Isabel was served on a Thursday morning. She called me 40 minutes after service. I did not answer. I sent a call to Patricia's office as we had agreed. Patricia's assistant logged the call and added it to the file. The FBI referral went in the same day as the service. Patricia had built the referral package over the 9 days with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. It included the complete financial documentation from both Kevin and me, the prior civil judgment, a timeline showing the parallel relationship operation across 2 cities, and Patricia's legal analysis of the interstate wire fraud elements. The referring agent, a woman named Special Agent Torres who called Patricia 3 days after the referral was received, said, and Patricia repeated this to me word for word, "This is a clean package. We do not usually get referrals this organized." Patricia said, "I have a good client." Agent Torres said, clearly, the formal investigation was opened within 2 weeks of the referral. Isabel received a federal target letter 1 month after the civil complaint was served. She retained an attorney 2 days after receiving the target letter. Her attorney contacted Patricia within the week. The conversation, as Patricia described it to me, was brief and businesslike. Her attorney said, "My client is interested in resolving the civil matter." Patricia said, "My client's position is full restitution of $61,400 plus legal costs plus damages, a formal written acknowledgement of the conduct, and a signed statement of facts that can be used in any subsequent proceeding." Her attorney said, "That last element is unusual." Patricia said, "It is a condition. It is not negotiable." Her attorney called back the following afternoon and accepted all terms. The settlement was signed 3 weeks later. Kevin and I received full restitution and costs within 45 days of the complaint filing. The signed statement of facts, in which Isabel acknowledged the specific conduct in both relationships in her own words with her own signature, went into our files and into the FBI's investigative record. The federal investigation moved at its own pace, which is slower than a civil case and more thorough. Agent Torres contacted me 4 times over the following 10 months for additional documentation and 1 formal interview. I provided everything promptly and completely and answered every question directly. 10 months after the referral, Isabel was indicted on 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of interstate fraud. The indictment referenced the prior civil judgment, the parallel relationship operation, and the signed statement of facts from our civil settlement as key evidentiary elements. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud in exchange for a sentencing recommendation. The sentence was 36 months of supervised probation, a substantial fine, mandatory restitution incorporated as a criminal judgment, and a federal fraud conviction that will appear on every background check she faces for the rest of her life. Her attorney had negotiated the plea carefully. It was, Patricia told me, about as good an outcome as that set of facts permitted. From her side, Kevin and I have talked about this a lot over the past year. The question of whether the outcome was enough, whether 36 months of probation and a conviction adequately accounts for what she did, not just to us, but to the man 6 years ago and likely to others we never identified. I do not have a clean answer. I think the federal conviction is meaningful in a practical sense because it closes doors that were previously open to her. I think the signed statement of facts is meaningful because it exists in writing in her own words in a federal record. I think the full restitution is meaningful because it removed the financial benefit of what she had done. Whether that adds up to justice in a larger sense, I genuinely do not know. What I know is that we did everything correctly and completely, and that the outcome was the best available one within the system we were operating in. Some days that feels like enough. Most days it does. I want to tell you where I am now, because I always think the ending matters. I am 43 years old. I am still a commercial real estate broker. My client base has grown in the 2 years since all of this happened, not because of it, but in spite of the time and energy it consumed. I did not get married in the timeline I had imagined. I'm not in a relationship currently, and I'm not in a hurry about that. I bought a better couch, which sounds like a small thing, but felt significant at the time. Kevin and I talk every few weeks. He is engaged again to a woman he met 8 months ago and describes as the least complicated person he has ever known, which he says with a gratitude that I completely understand. He asked me to be at the wedding, and I said yes without hesitating. Someone asked me recently what I learned from all of this. I thought about it. Then I said, I learned that charm is a skill, and that skills can be developed for purposes that have nothing to do with you. And I learned that the moment you stop looking for reasons to trust someone and start looking at what is actually there, you see things very clearly very quickly. If this story hit you, leave a comment. This is Reddit Confessions. Subscribe. New story every single week.